This year, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States. And most of the time here on the channel, we concentrate on the lives of regular people. What are they eating? What is their life like? But in this time, we want to look at the lives of the leaders, the political leaders, the military leaders, the thought leaders of America and Great Britain in the 18th century, right here at the War of Independence. Understanding what people eat gives us a true sense of their lives, and what better meal to study than breakfast. If we're talking about leaders of America during the War of Independence, we want to think about George Washington. What was George Washington's favorite breakfast? One of the great things about this particular set of leaders is that we've got wonderful documentation on all of them. They have left behind reams of papers and books and letters about themselves, so we have some really clear sense about their lives and especially sometimes their meals. Well, George Washington's favorite breakfast was cornmeal pancakes, might be called hoe cakes or mush cakes. He loved them smothered in honey and butter, along with 3 or 4 cups of tea. That's what he ate in the morning. We have multiple documents that point to this sort of favorite breakfast of George Washington. It's interesting here that this is not high-class eating. Now, these are guests that are writing about this. It's more than likely that they were at the breakfast table. There were probably lots of other things to choose from. When you have guests, you have a lot of different choices. But for George Washington himself, he always ate basically the same thing. At least that's what it looks like. A very homely, kind of working man meal. Now there is one caveat here. Notice that on his basically cornmeal pancakes, he's having honey, not molasses. So most of the lower class people in Virginia that are eating probably this very same breakfast would likely have them plain or with something that was inexpensive like molasses. At least here George Washington has probably a much higher class honey on top of his. One of the thought leaders in the time period that we have wonderful documentation on is, of course, Benjamin Franklin. And while he was fairly old by the time we get to the War of Independence, he was still influential. Now, he wrote about a couple of different stages in his life about breakfast. In his autobiography, he talks about when he's a young man, and he eats a very, very simple breakfast of something like just bread and milk. Maybe they were put together and kind of warmed up like a panada, or maybe he just ate them like that. This is pretty standard. He was a very frugal man when he was growing up, and when he was a young man, he talks about eating simply when he was an apprentice kind of a person in England. And even when he comes home, he does Poor Richard's Almanac, right? He talks about eating in moderation and everything. So early on in life, he was a very frugal eater, but then when he becomes rich and later on in life, he writes almost a satirical letter about his gout and his eating too much for breakfast. He was having a rich breakfast with, meats and wines, and he certainly had this kind of 2 stages in life there. Here is the older and indulgent Franklin, and he's writing in his dialogue between Franklin and the gout in 1780. While the mornings are long and you have the leisure to go abroad, what do? Why, instead of gaining an appetite for breakfast by a salutary exercise, you amuse yourself with books and pamphlets and newspapers which commonly are not worth reading. Yet you eat an inordinate breakfast, 4 dishes of tea with cream and 1 or 2 buttered toasts with slices of hung beef, which I fancy are not things most easily digested. Now, if we go across the waters, who are we going to look at for the most extravagant breakfasts? Well, how about King George III, the very man who the Declaration of Independence was written to. The standard breakfast of King George III was dry bread and unsweetened tea. He was actually an eccentric when it came to eating. Here he was living in palaces. They have the records of all the purchases for the king and the household. They were ordering thousands of pounds of meat every week. I mean, it was tremendous, the kind of cooking that had to go on. But the king himself and his family ate very, very frugally. Not because they didn't have the money, but because he was actually very, very concerned with his health. He was concerned that his family had a propensity toward obesity. So he himself restricted his own diet and sometimes the diet of his children, specifically his son. He was concerned about him being overweight. And so he had some very strict rules about eating. So here we have the King of England. We think of the King of England, we think of, ermine robes and crowns and scepters, or some of the most expensive clothes available in the world. And yet here he is eating dry bread for breakfast. Before we leave the King of England, let's talk about George III's son, who turns out to be King George IV. This is in the 19th century, so it's a little bit later. But he did not take well to his father's restricting his diet. And when he gets of age, he does not restrict his diet in the least. His breakfast was 3 pigeons, 2 beefsteaks, champagne, port wine, and basically whatever else he wanted. He was renowned for having as much food as he could stand. And so he is the complete opposite to his father and much more of the kingly breakfasts that we might think of. The Duke of Wellington writes about King George IV's breakfast. He says, it's a pigeon, a beefsteak pie, 3 parts of a bottle of Moselle wine, a glass of dry champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy. Now let's turn to probably the most foodie of all of the founding fathers, and that's Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was younger than a lot of these other men, and he spent time overseas, especially in Europe, doing diplomatic work. And while he was there, he was exposed to a lot of amazing cuisine, from French cooking, Italian cooking, and Dutch cooking. He wanted to bring back a lot of these ideas with him. So we've talked about Thomas Jefferson and his pasta machine in other episodes. We do have some wonderful documentation about his eating habits in Monticello, and we have some manuscript cookbooks, etc. to look at. People talk about eating breakfasts there and how extravagant they were, or at least full in a Virginia style, but also served in a French way. He would have, of course, coffee and tea. He had muffins, and they're apparently special muffin recipes. He also had cornbread and a type of ham. There is even a reference to them eating multiple kinds of bread and eating that while it's fresh. So there are some references where people are worried about eating very, very fresh bread. It's one of the reasons why they toasted it. They thought it might mess up your guts. Maybe you would tie your stomach in knots if you had fresh bread. Apparently Thomas Jefferson was not worried about that. But one of the more intriguing and possibly breakfasty foods that Thomas Jefferson was interested in was waffles. He spent time in Amsterdam, and he comes back with 4 waffle irons. And in some of the manuscript cookbooks, we have recipes for waffles. Now, waffles are interesting. It's thought that maybe he made them more popular, but there isn't a lot of documentation on that. Thomas Jefferson, while he gets introduced to waffles probably while he's in Holland, it isn't brand new for North America. In fact, we have multiple references to waffles being early, maybe even 17th century, when the people come over and settle in New England because they had connections with Holland at that time. And also, of course, the New York area, which is New Netherlands. It was settled originally by people from the Netherlands. So they have a very strong waffle tradition there. And if we look in the English cookbooks, we see recipes that are called Dutch wafers. The reality is these are waffles. In those English cookbooks, they just hadn't really got that term yet. So that's what we're gonna make today. I'm gonna make waffles probably exactly like something that Thomas Jefferson would have. This recipe is called To Make Dutch Wafers, and it is out of the Dictionarium Domesticum by Nathan Bailey in 1736. fairly early recipe. It says, beat 8 eggs very well, then take 2 spoonfuls of fine sugar, 2 nutmegs grated, 2 whole nutmegs grated, a quart of cream, 2 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of butter melted, 5 or 6 spoonfuls of rose water, 4 spoonfuls of yeast. Mix it all well together. Bake them in waffle tongs on the fire. And for sauce, take grated cinnamon, sack and melted butter, sweeten to taste. This is the first recipe I have seen where they make the sauce with cinnamon in it. Very interesting. We are going to shrink this recipe way down. We're going to make a quarter version of it. This would probably make like 100 waffles. And we are going to skip the rose water because that would just be way overpowering. And we'll even cut back the nutmeg a little bit. And the nutmeg should be plenty. It really is a great flavor in this, something a little different than your standard waffles. We're gonna mix our liquid ingredients up first. It calls for 8 eggs. We're gonna do a quarter size version on this, so 2 eggs. I'm gonna add to that 1 cup of milk and a ½ pound of butter melted. We don't want it to be too hot, so have this butter melted and then let it cool off a little bit. But if it's a little warm, that's all right. That'll help actually the yeast work. So we want this whole mixture to be about 80 degrees or so when we're done with it. I'm gonna set these liquid ingredients off to the side. Let's work on our dry ingredients. I have a ½ pound of flour here. It's exactly the same amount of flour as butter in weight. We're also gonna add in probably about a quarter of a cup of sugar to this. We can add in the nutmeg now. They called for 2 whole nutmegs. If we quarter that, about a ½ nutmeg, even that is a lot of nutmeg these days. So put some nutmeg in there. It will make a difference in the flavor. Now that our dry ingredients are stirred up, we can put in our wet ingredients, and we are going to go ahead and add the yeast at this point too. And let's get this all stirred together and mixed well. Once this is mixed well, we want to set this aside. This particular recipe doesn't talk about it, but other Dutch wafer recipes call for setting this aside for at least an hour, probably 3 or 4, because this yeast has to get working. And I can see that if you were going to make these for breakfast, you might make this the night before, and then it would really have time to work on itself. We got a set of period waffle tongs here. These are tricky to use. Very interesting. We do have some documentation for waffle tongs in America in the 17th century, I believe, in an inventory for somebody's will in New York. They had waffle tongs as part of their inventory. The trick on this is getting it up to temperature. We need it to be 325, 350 degrees on both sides. I don't know what they did in the time period except to just have a good feel for it. There's also directions about having a little cloth bag of butter. So you put a little ball of butter in a cloth bag and you use that to butter the tongs. I usually just put a goodly amount of butter on this to begin with, and then the first waffle doesn't turn out just right, but after that they turn out just fine, and I don't have to butter it again for another, say, 10 waffles. Our waffles came out very easily in the waffle iron. It was actually much easier to use than I was expecting. These smell tremendous. They have plenty of nutmeg in it, and that really is a key feature of these. Now, this is kind of similar to a modern day waffle, except these are yeast risen instead of something like a quick leavening agent like we would use baking powder or baking soda. I really like the sauce that this recipe comes with. It has the sack, it has sugar, it has butter, and cinnamon, which again I haven't seen before, so let's give this a try. I've got this nice warm one right out of the tongs. We poured the sauce on top. That sauce is so good. And these turned out white and fluffy and very buttery. The butter's right there in the batter, so it's so tremendously good. These would make an amazing breakfast, and I'm not so sure that it was certainly only a breakfast kind of dish. I'm pretty sure in the 18th century, this might show up basically any time of day. But I can see the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson especially, enjoying these waffles.